everybody! So I started recording a video. It was going pretty well, I really liked it. But then Cortana interrupted me and started to show me movie tickets, and I was like, that isn't... go away. And so I told her to turn off, and she was like, are you sure? And I was like, yeah, I really want you to turn off. And so then she turned off my computer. So from the beginning. Alright, the Dark Soul. So originally, you have the furtive pygmy, who is the progenitor of all of mankind. He comes across a fourth unique Lord Soul, known as the Dark Soul. He finds this Lord Soul, and then he divides it up, and that then becomes humanity, right? So all of humanity has a little bit of the Dark Soul inside of him. In an interview, Miyazaki specifically says, "It isn't written anywhere, but the image is something like humanity's ancestor. He found the Lord Soul, fragmented it, and humanity are like the fragments of it, kind of like an ancestor, yeah. So the descendants, the humans, have a part of that Lord Soul. So all of humanity comes from the Dark Soul, right? The Dark Soul was originally this single solid entity until it was kind of split apart by the furtive pygmy, and that created humanity, right? So all of humanity comes from the Dark Soul. In the introductory cutscene, the narrator talks about how the fire is fading, the age of fire is dying, and eventually the age of dark will take over, and everything will be shrouded in darkness. And later, Guinevere specifically says that the age of dark is going to be like this long, cold, frigid night, right? So it's going to be dark, it's going to be cold, it's going to last a really long time, what was the other thing? Oh, and it's inevitable, right? It's inevitable. Eventually, inevitably, the Age of Dark is going to take over. And so Gwyn is trying to stagnate and cling on to the Age of Fire for as long as possible until people can really find a solution and sort of defeat the darkness once and for all. But then Gwyn eventually goes hollow, so now there has to be a chosen undead to go to the first bonfire, the first flame, and sacrifice himself in the fire and use his own soul as kindling for the fire in order to extend the Age of Fire and prevent the Age of Dark. Right? And the primordial serpent, Kath, I'm just going to call him Carl because I have trouble with his name. It's spelled one way and it's pronounced a different way. So I'm just going to call him Carl. He specifically says that the Age of Dark is the Age of Men, right? The Age of Dark is the Age of Men. Mankind and the darkness are equated to each other. They are the same thing. And he says that when the Age of Dark takes over, right? When the fire fades and the Age of Fire is done, the Age of Dark is going to be a thing. That's going to be the Age of Men. And so Gwyn is afraid of the darkness, and he's afraid of humanity, of the darkness that's within humanity. He is afraid of the Dark Soul. So again, darkness and humanity are equated with each other. They are the same thing. The four kings have this special move where they can seize the protagonist and then just sort of sap the humanity out of him. And the Dark Race have a very similar move where they take the protagonist and they just like draw humanity out of him. The Dark Race, incited by Carl, use the power of the Dark Soul to absorb humanity, an art shared by this weapon, which also acts as a special shield. The ancients particularly could sap the humanity of even a replete saint in the blink of an eye. So they use the power of the Dark Soul in order to take people's humanity, right? So again, the Dark Soul is able to like take humanity and then take that humanity and make it a part of the Dark Soul again. So it's like the humanity is being made whole again by returning to the Dark Soul. And humanity is described as this black sprite is called humanity, but little is known about its true nature. If the soul is the source of all life, then what distinguishes the humanity that we hold within ourselves, or something like that, okay? So if the soul is the source of all life, then what distinguishes the humanity that we hold within ourselves? So these two things are kind of juxtaposed to each other, right? So the soul being associated with life, and it's like this little flicker of a flame, while the humanity is supposed to be kind of the opposite of that. So if the soul is the source of life, then it's like humanity is the source of death, right? Death, vacant nothingness, right? The abyss. If you look at humanity, it is just this black vacant void, right? In world mythology, it's like the soul is this immortal, everlasting, divine sprite kind of a thing, right? It kind of defeats death. So it isn't that after a person dies, he goes into a vacant black non-existence. Instead, it's more like there is no death. There is just what comes after life. There is just the afterlife. There is just the soul and where that goes into some kind of like heavenly realm. So the dark soul seems to me to be the reality that in Dark Souls, there is no immortality. There is no immortal soul. Everything eventually dies and everything eventually returns to darkness. The Age of Men, the Age of Dark will one day take over. And what distinguishes men from gods, right? There's the Age of Men and then there's the Age of Fire, which is ruled over by gods. It is that idea of immortality. The gods are supposed to be immortal. They're supposed to have an immortal soul, right? Gwyn has this soul inside of him, but he doesn't have the dark soul inside of him. He doesn't have this vacant nothingness inside of him. But to be a man is to be mortal, right? Gods are immortal. Humans are mortal. So the Age of Dark is the Age of Men because it's describing mortality. The idea that there is no immortal soul and death eventually comes for everyone. I think that is supposed to be the very harsh truth of Dark Souls. Like a very important theme in Dark Souls is the quest for the truth, right? Like Carl, the most important thing to him is the truth.
I can guide thee and illuminate the truth. The truth I shall share without sentiment. Gwyn has blurred your past to prevent the birth of the Dark Lord. I seek to right the wrongs of the past, to discover our true Lord. Only I know the truth about your fate. You must destroy the fading Lord Gwyn, who has coddled fire and resisted nature, and become the fourth Lord, so that you may usher in an age of dark. Nonsense. Are you mad? This is deplorable. You would rather be a slave? Does the truth mean nothing to you? This is unacceptable, impossible, unthinkable. Oh, enough with you. Farewell, pitiful, unknowing fool.
So I was watching this and editing it, and it actually made me start thinking a bit, and I was like, that's a very interesting point, actually. Because now I've noticed that there is this correlation in Dark Souls between sort of being a slave and being ignorant, or having knowledge and having freedom, right? So if you've ever read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, that book does a pretty incredible job about depicting the true importance of knowledge and education and being able to read. For whatever reason, there is this very bizarre phenomenon where like people who know how to read tend to be more rebellious. So Frederick Douglass was a slave, and at the time, in many states, it was illegal for slaves to be able to read or to own books. Because there was this very deliberate strategy conducted by slave owners to keep slaves uneducated and to keep them illiterate. Because slave owners actually knew that if slaves knew how to read, then they would be more likely to rebel. However bizarre that seems, raw strength and numeric value, how many of them there are, that doesn't matter nearly as much as simply, do they know how to read or don't they? Because if they know how to read, they're going to fight back. And Frederick Douglass actually taught himself how to read, kind of illegally, and then once he learned the truth, he got more and more upset. And as he read more and more and more, it's like it tormented him more and more and more. And he became very, very upset with the way the world was, and he really, really wanted to change it. So once he learned how to read, once he learned the truth, he became very upset with the people who owned him and he actually kind of thrashed them, and he fought back, and then he escaped. So for whatever reason, it's this very bizarre phenomenon where people who know how to read, people who sort of know the truth and have knowledge, they tend to be a bit more tenacious, and they tend to be more rebellious, for whatever reason. So slave owners had this very deliberate strategy where they would try to deprive slaves of the truth. They would try to deprive them of knowledge and books and education in order to keep control, right? In order to control them. And not just that, but slave owners would actually bend the truth a bit in order to justify their positions, right? Right? So it's like if you think of like a hierarchy, you have the slave owners up here, and then you have the slaves who are way down here at the very bottom. And so it's like people deep down probably know that that isn't really fair, that isn't really right, that isn't probably something that you should do. So the reality of the hierarchy and of the world around them is probably pretty disturbing and uncomfortable. So the way slave owners can justify their own position in the hierarchy and to say, I'm up here and you're down there, is to actually use the Bible and to twist it pretty considerably. So if you've ever heard of the curse of Ham, the idea is that Ham's father, Canaan, walked in on his father, Noah, who was a little bit undressed. And because Canaan did that, his son Ham and all of Ham's descendants were cursed to be servile to Noah's other children, right? So slave owners looked at Africans who had a different color of skin and said, well, because they have a different tone of skin, that means that they have the curse of Ham. Even though the Bible never mentions anything about skin tone or anything like that, slave owners made that enormous leap in order to justify their ownership of Africans. And people really did believe that. Slave owners really did believe that there was this curse of Ham and that Africans had the curse of Ham. Even though the Bible never says anything about skin color, they made that enormous leap in order to justify their positions and help them sleep more comfortably at night. So it's to justify it to themselves, and it's to justify it to everybody else, right? I'm up here and you're down there, and that's justified because God says so. You know, there's that line from the witch Carla where she says something like,
humans are of the dark, and you are no different. Some may avert their eyes, but the truth remains the truth. Be careful, though. Few humans are privy to this knowledge. Let it be a secret, kept between you and I.
The truth is still the truth, right? So even though it's an uncomfortable truth, that is the truth. So for slave owners who were probably made uncomfortable by their own positions and who probably understood the truth, that they probably didn't deserve what they had or should be allowed to do the things that they were doing, they would bend the truth and believe their own lie in order to justify their own positions. And so that's kind of the idea with Gwyn, where he's able to kind of obscure the truth and obscure the reality of the darkness in order to make life a little bit more comfortable for everybody else and say, don't worry, you're not going to die. I'm not going to let you die. You're just going to live on perpetually. So Gwyn obscures the truth in order to make life a little bit more comfortable. Not only that, but Gwyn also uses knowledge to control people, right? So when Osiris says,
you ignorant slaves.
Dwight, you ignorant slut!
You ignorant slaves, right? Ignorance leads to slavery, right? If Gwyn is able to control the truth and control what people know, then he can control people, right? He can control people's actions. And people won't go down this path over here if they don't even know that it exists. So not only are they bending the truth in order to justify their positions, but they're bending the truth in order to control people, right? Sort of being able to control knowledge and control what people know sort of determines the choices that they're going to make in life. So if slave owners are able to control the information that slaves have, they're better able to control them like that, right? Deprive them of an education, deprive them of the truth, and they won't be able to fight back, or they'll be considerably less likely to fight back. And Gwyn has a habit of kind of obscuring the truth and kind of bending history to suit his own needs, right? So if you go to Anor Londo, it's this seemingly very bright, beautiful place. But then once you destroy the illusion of Guinevere, who is this big, beautiful woman, right? Once you destroy her, and I guess once you kill Gwendolyn too, then the illusion is gone. It's over now. The truth comes about that Anor Londo is not as pretty as it seems to be, and the gods are all gone. So again, it's like there's like Gwyn and his family who are trying to obscure the truth, and then there is like Carl and people who kind of side with the darkness, who are kind of in pursuit of the truth. Because the reality is, there is no immortality. Everything eventually comes to an end, and there isn't really an immortal soul. Instead, there is the dark soul. Instead, there is mortality, right? To be human is to be mortal. Eventually, the age of man will take over. The age of dark will take over, and there will be a vacant nothingness. Eventually, everything will die. That is the truth. And even if that's a very harsh truth, and something that we don't necessarily like to think about, again, part of Dark Souls is that you are supposed to find the truth. That's how you find peace. So you can stick with the lie, you can stick with Gwyn, or you can pursue the truth, right? Those are the big two options. And so I almost wonder if it's sort of like a harsh criticism of the idea of religion, in that it's just a way to comfort people's anxiety regarding the inevitability of death. The idea that, don't worry, there is no death, there's just what comes after life. There is just the afterlife. Dark Souls says, no, that isn't the truth, that is a lie. Even if the truth is harsh and it's something that you might not want to look at, the truth is that the Dark Soul, the Age of Men, the Age of Dark, will eventually take over. Eventually, we're all gonna die. And yeah, that's a pretty harsh truth. In Dark Souls 3, there are these weird snake-like abyss creatures known as the Pus of Man, right? The Pus of Man. So the idea is that there is a darkness within humanity, and it can spill out like blood or other fluids. So the darkness is innate to humanity. The darkness and humans, they're kind of the same thing. Humans come from the darkness, and they have that darkness within them, and it can spill out of them like the Pus of Man. Or if we even think of Manus, right? Manus. He is the father of the abyss, and he's Manus. He is a man. He is human. To be human is to be mortal and to be of the dark. And the way the protagonist can strengthen the bonfire, can strengthen the Age of Fire, is by taking humanity, taking the symbol of darkened, vacant nothingness, and burning it in the bonfire. So literally, you're destroying the darkness with light, right? You're taking light and extinguishing the darkness. And that's how you extend the Age of Fire, is by destroying the darkness. And let's keep in mind that originally there is only one Dark Soul, right? So originally there's this one Dark Soul that is split apart into tinier pieces of humanity, and that becomes the human race. So originally it's like we all come from the same thing. We all come from the Dark Soul. Originally there's this one single soul that is vacant nothingness. That's where we all come from. So if you think that before I was born, I didn't exist. After I die, I'm not going to exist. I'm going to return to the same non-existent nothingness from which I came out of. That is the Dark Soul. The Dark Soul is the idea of non-existence. It's where we come from, and it's where we're going to. And oftentimes in Dark Souls, the darkness is sort of looked at kind of fondly, and people often use this very important word, nostalgia. Remember that very important word, nostalgia? Because it is nostalgic. That's where humanity comes from. And so people look at the darkness kind of like they look at childhood, and it's something that they want to return to. It's like when people want to return to their youth, the darkness, the Dark Soul, is like the ultimate form of that. Because that is the very beginning. It's a full circle back to nothingness. So that's what Gwyn, a god, is so afraid of. He is afraid of dying. He is afraid of nothingness. He is afraid of the Dark Soul. He is afraid of human mortality, and that's why he doesn't want the Age of Men, the Age of Dark, to take over. Right? Because when that happens, he won't be so godly anymore. He won't really have this immortal soul. He won't be a god. He'll be just like everyone else and share the exact same black, non-existent abyss. Right? Everything dies. Everything eventually returns to the non-existent, vacant, absent nothingness from which it first arose out of. If we consider Nito, right, he is the Grave Lord. He is the literal personification of death. He is the god of death. And he's this amalgamation of skeletons and carcasses and bones and things like that, all amalgamating together into one solid entity, right? So again, if we remember the Dark Soul, It's this original solid entity that is just one thing, and then it's split apart into much smaller bits of humanity. And so Nito is kind of like the Dark Soul coming back together again into one single entity. And again, Nito is the god of death. He is the grave lord. And there's an old saying, death is the great equalizer, right? So it's the idea that whether you are the toughest king in the entire world and you own everything, or you're the lowliest peasant and you own absolutely nothing, we all die the same death, and we all eventually return to death. We all eventually go back to where we came from. And so Nito is kind of that personification of everyone coming back into the same thing and returning to the same thing from which they first hailed out of, right? It is the Dark Soul reforming itself back together. Or if we consider the necromancer Pinwheel, who is seemingly a father, a mother, and a child all amalgamated together into a single body, he's a necromancer. He is trying to conquer death, and he's running these weird experiments and reading these books and trying to figure out how to be like Nito. And again, he is this amalgamation of things all coming together through death. And death is the thing that unifies us and brings us all back together into what we first came out of. Or if we think about Aldrich, who is again this amalgamation of death and carcasses and maggots. Whenever he eats people, he is able to share their consciousness and their memories, or at least their memories. Like the Life Hunt site specifically says, Aldrich dreamt as he slowly devoured the god of the dark moon. In this dream, he perceived the form of a young pale girl in hiding. So Aldrich consumes Gwendolyn, and even though he's never met Priscilla, he's able to have a dream of Priscilla, right? Gwendolyn knows about Priscilla, and so when Aldrich eats Gwendolyn, he knows about Priscilla and is able to use Priscilla's Life Hunt scythe thing. So when Aldrich consumes people, he's able to share their memories and share their consciousness. And like, it's referred to several times, I'll have to look it up, but it's referred to several times on several different items and things, that Aldrich, he likes to eat kids, specifically. Like Henri and Horace were the only two kids to have escaped Aldrich, right? So he likes to eat kids. And again, if we think that death is sort of this nostalgic thing, right? It's where we came out of. When Aldrich eats people and consumes the darkness within them, that humanity, he's able to feel that nostalgia. And so eating kids is kind of nostalgic because it's like he sort of envies his youth. The other From Software game, Deracine, kind of makes this theme a little bit clearer, where it is about adults or older kids sort of stealing the youths of younger children because they're sort of addicted to that nostalgia and they pursue it rather mindlessly and almost as if they're not in control of it. So I have a hunch that Aldrich is possessed by his own nostalgia, and he wants to return to like his youth, and even before that, to a moment before he was even born, to the non-existence of the Dark Soul. The Ringed Knight Straightsword tells us, straight sword wielded by the Ringed Knights. The arms of early men were forged in the abyss and betray a smidgen of life. For this reason, the gods cast a seal of fire upon them and those who possessed them. The Dragonhead Shield tells us, the Ringed Knights, by command of the gods, stood amongst the ranks who set out to slay the dragons, but their contributions were never lauded. Okay, so the arms of early men were forged in the abyss. Okay? For this reason, the gods cast a seal of fire upon these swords and those who possessed them. Okay. Ba-boom! There it is, okay? So the Ringed Knights forge their weapons in the abyss, and the gods don't like that, so the gods cast a seal of fire on these abyssal weapons, I guess to keep the abyss from taking them over, right? So even though Gwen works with the Ringed Knights to kill off dragons, right? What was it say specifically? The Ringed Knights, by command of the gods, stood amongst the ranks who set out to slay the dragons. So the Ringed Knights helped Gwen defeat the dragons, but their contributions were never lauded, right? So Gwen specifically kind of tried to erase the history of the Pygmies and the Ringed Knights and the humans. And even though they work together, they don't necessarily see eye to eye on all things. And in the Dark Souls beginning narration video, whatever, it specifically says,
and the furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten.
The furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten, right? When it's talking about the war with the dragons, it says that, oh, Gwyn was there, and Nito was there, and Izalith was there, or the Witch of Izalith was there, and Seath was there. They all worked together to defeat the dragons. Doesn't say anything about the furtive pygmy, because the furtive pygmy is so easily forgotten. Because Gwyn specifically tried to erase the history of the pygmies and of the humans. So even if Gwyn is allied to a particular character, doesn't necessarily mean that he likes them very much. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the other lords are opposed to the Age of Dark. The pygmies specifically kind of like the Age of Dark. That seems to be where they seem to understand it very well, better than most. Like, Carl even says that the furtive pygmy wanted to bring about the Age of Dark, the Age of Men. And Gwyn worked with the pygmies, regardless of that horrifying fact. So just because Gwyn is allied with someone doesn't necessarily mean that he sees eye to eye with them on all things. So the dragons, they represent stagnant time. Time is not moving forwards, nor is it moving backwards. You know, these dragons are these motionless, unthinking, unfeeling beasts who just kind of sit there and don't do much of anything. And they're stone, they're made of rock. So the dragons are specifically representations of stagnant time. Time is not moving forwards, nor is it moving backwards. It's just kind of sticking around. If we think about the history of the universe, you know, before Earth was populated with various life forms, it was really just rock and magma, right? So the Age of the Ancients, when the dragons are just kind of hanging around and they're made of rock and they're just kind of sitting and not really doing much of anything at all, that's kind of like that's kind of like Earth before it was populated with various life forms, and it's almost like time is not moving forwards, nor is it moving backwards. Or if we think of Seath the Scaleless, you know, he has this prison laboratory thing where there's this ominous ticking sound going on, and there are these clockwork gears everywhere. So it sort of evokes a feeling of being on the inside of a clock, right? And what is Seath after? He's trying to create scales so that way he can be timeless and immortal like the other dragons. So again, it's like Seath is trying to conquer time. He's trying to become immortal. And he's trying to become timeless like the everlasting dragons. So in order for death to be a thing, and in order for the Age of Fire to be a thing, time has to move forward. In order for people to start living and in order for people to start dying, the dragons have to be defeated and time has to move forward. Gwyn can start preserving the Age of Fire, and some other characters can start trying to bring about the Age of Dark, the Age of Men. So both opposing forces work together to beat their mutual enemy, stagnant time, the everlasting dragons. So even Nito, despite being an ally to Gwyn, he might not necessarily want to preserve the Age of Fire like Gwyn does. He might be more associated with the Dark Abyss. You know, he is the first of the dead. His realm is shrouded in this severe darkness that's second really only to like the Abyss of New Londo and the Abyss of Ulasil, right? So Nito seems pretty associated with death and darkness and vacant absence. And let's think about the dark sign for a second, right? So the dark sign is a black spot that appears on a person's body, and there's a ring of fire around it, right? And it's supposedly a sign of the curse of the gods or something like that, right? I think the idea is that it is the darkness within humans beginning to seep out, right? Sort of like the pus of man. But there's a ring of fire cast around it in order to keep that from happening, right? That is the dark sign. So the darkness comes from within humans, but then the gods cast a ring of fire around the darkness in order to keep it from spreading and growing, from spilling out like the pus of man. Like the Ring Knight Straightsword tells us that they were forged in the abyss, and the gods cast a seal of fire on them, presumably to keep the abyss from taking over, or to keep the abyss at bay or whatever. And the dark sign tells us, the dark sign signifies an accursed undead. Those branded with it are reborn after death, but will one day lose their mind and go hollow. Death triggers the dark sign, which returns its bearer to the last bonfire rested at. So the dark sign keeps people from dying, right? There's this darkness inside of humans That's innate to them. It's what they're born with. Then the gods cast a seal of fire around it in order to keep people from dying, in order to keep them from returning their dark souls to the original dark soul, to the darkness. Instead of dying, the human is returned to a bonfire and is just reborn after death into the exact same body. But he loses some of his humanity, and he goes hollow a little bit. So the point of the dark sign is to keep people from dying. It is to keep people from going into the abyss. So again, it comes across to me that in Dark Souls, humanity is innately, deeply touched by darkness. Humans are compulsively pulled into the abyss because that's their home. That's their place of origin. That's where the rest of their soul, the dark soul, awaits. And that's why there are a few subtle clues about how there is a sense of nostalgia in darkness, as if it's a place familiar to humans. Non-existence. I didn't exist before my birth, and I will cease to exist after my death. I will return to the same nothingness from which I came out of, along with all of the rest of you. And so in the ending of the game, in which the character chooses to forsake the fire and become the Dark Lord and bring about the Age of Men, the fire fades, and the darkness of the abyss is allowed to consume the world unshackled without Gwyn's magic to contain it. Immortal godliness expires, and all human mortality takes its place. And that's why it is both the Age of Dark and the Age of Men, because men are mortal. In Hindu belief, there is... all of creation came from this one individual soul known as Brahman, right? All of creation, all of humanity, the whole universe, all the rocks, all the planets, all the stars, everything comes from the original soul, Brahman. And there isn't necessarily just one creation story. There are these entire cycles of life and death and entire universes that come into existence and leave it. So individual souls, like my soul, departs from Brahman and becomes me, I guess. And when I die, it's like I am reborn into a new body, but with the same soul. And the goal of the soul is to end these constant cycles by realizing one's wholeness with Brahman and living a good life and having good karma. Or am I mixing that with Buddhism? I might have mixed that with Buddhism. No. I think that is in Hinduism. And I think it's about like sticking to your caste and stuff like that. But that's not important. The important thing is that there's that in Hindu belief, there's this one soul known as Brahman, and then pieces of it kind of depart and create all of these individual souls and all of existence as we know it. And the goal of the soul, of like my soul, is to realize my wholeness with Brahman and to return to Brahman, which can take lifetimes and lifetimes and lifetimes of birth and death, of reincarnation, until I eventually get it right. So Hinduism isn't even necessarily polytheistic, because it's like, there is just this one God, there is just this one soul, and everything else is sort of just like a small fragment of that original soul. And so Dark Souls is kind of like it's sort of like an atheistic view of Brahman, in that instead of saying that it's this like divine soul or whatever, it's sort of just like the vacant nothingness of space. So our universe prior to the Big Bang, really. And eventually that's where we're all going to return to. And it's my understanding that inevitably there will be more of creation in the future. Mathematically, inevitably, it will happen. It's just kind of inevitable. And inevitably, everything in the universe will eventually cease to exist. That is inevitable. Even the tiniest little particles, eventually, one day, will kind of burn out and dissipate, and there will be nothing left. So inevitably, everything will be destroyed, and inevitably, things will be created all over again. That is inevitable. And so it's impossible for us to know, well, how many universes have existed prior to this one? Could there have been countless prior? And will there be countless more in the future? Maybe, who knows? That's a very, very interesting thought. And I should also note that in Hinduism, it isn't like death is the end. Again, death is sort of just change. I'm in this body now, but in the future, I might be a woman, or I might be a lizard, maybe both, right? I'm eventually going to change. And so to cling on to this life is sort of depriving me of my enlightenment and my return to Brahman, right? I have to go through these constant cycles until I eventually get things right and I can return to Brahman and I can be whole again. So Gwyn kind of represents the opposite of that. because he is clinging so hard to this mortal life and is trying so hard to make it immortal. He's never going to be able to return to the dark soul. He's never going to be able to return to nothingness because he's afraid of it. He doesn't want that. And his desperation to keep things exactly the same is sort of what hollows the world around him and what corrupts it and kind of what makes things kind of get worse and worse. And like Gwyn's desire to keep things exactly the same is kind of a corruption of his original mission to destroy the timeless everlasting dragons. It's like there's this amount of envy that takes place where it seems like Gwyn sort of wants to be like the everlasting dragons, and maybe his family kind of wants to be like the everlasting dragons. And so there are these imposter dragons that start popping up because they want to be timeless and everlasting like the dragons. There's a specific line from the Pyromancer in Dark Souls 1 where he says, "When I gave you my fire, I gave you a piece of myself." So it is possible in Dark Souls for an individual to sort of divide a piece of himself and give it to someone else. Or it might even be possible for someone else to carve a piece out of me and just take it and steal it. So it's like the soul can get smaller and smaller and smaller and more divided. And I guess more and more numerous. So as time moves forward, it's like the soul is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And over time, it's becoming more and more numerous. And so I think that might kind of be part of what's going on with all of the Halloween, where people go crazy and they turn into these zombie creatures and stuff like that. And Herbert West pointed out that humanity is also equated to like vermin and locusts and parasites and maggots and things like that. The Firekeeper soul tells us each Firekeeper is a corporeal manifestation of her bonfire and a draw for the humanity which is offered to her. Her soul is gnawed by infinite humanity and can boost the power of the precious Estus flask. So when a bonfire is kindled and empowered by humanity, that humanity shatters and corrupts and is imprisoned in the Firekeeper. Just like the mute Firekeeper is locked in a cell which disappears into this vacant darkness, her chest, her bosom, is a prison for the shattered corruption of humanity. And by clinging to the Age of Fire, the Dark Soul becomes more and more corrupted over time. And these insect-like creatures start arising out of it. And this is really most apparent in Dark Souls 3, where much of the game is about fighting these maggots and bugs and locusts and things. And Aldrich is kind of the epitome of all of that. Each Firekeeper is a corporeal manifestation of her bonfire and a draw for the humanity which is offered to her. Her soul is gnawed by infinite humanity and can boost the power of the precious Estus flask. So when the protagonist takes humanity and burns it in the bonfire, it shatters and breaks apart into a bunch of tiny little pieces that are like smaller versions of humanity, and they're like these parasitic creatures almost. And the Firekeeper, who is a corporeal manifestation of her bonfire, is the one who sort of absorbs all of that and sort of keeps it in her chest, in her heart. A Firekeeper's soul is a draw for humanity, and held within their bosoms, just below a thin layer of skin, are swarms of humanity that writhe and squirm. Was the Ash Maiden locked in this dark prison for some transgression or by her own will? Held within their bosoms, below just a thin layer of skin, are swarms of humanity that writhe and squirm. Her brass armor serves to disguise this ghastly form. Held within their bosoms, below just a thin layer of skin, are swarms of humanity that writhe and squirm. To the fair lady, the countless eggs which appeared were cradles for each tiny humanity. And if you visit Rosaria in Dark Souls 3, she's surrounded by all of these childish maggot creatures. And in her bedchamber are all of these cradles. They are all over the place. They're hanging on the ceiling. They're on the floor. She's sort of coddling a giant maggot baby, basically. So the shattering and breaking apart and shrinking of humanity is sort of depicted as this parasitic, insect-like, arachnid-like sin, and is often associated with infantile qualities, right? Like every Firekeeper is a woman, right, and is sort of very motherly. So Kagari is a part of Japanese culture in which a stagnant body of water is a source of uncleanliness and parasites and eggs and things like that. Because in a stagnant body of water, mosquitoes like to fly there and lay their eggs in that water. And so the deepest part of the stagnant body of water is where all of that filth accumulates and all of the vermin breeds and all of the eggs collect, and it basically becomes a nursery for some nasty little creatures, right? But if the water is moving and it's like a river, then all the eggs and all the filth just gets washed away. And then there's that phrase, cleanliness is next to godliness. So in a world before microscopes, plague and disease was kind of like a moral condemnation by the gods, right? If you get hit with a plague, that's because God did it, right? Because people didn't really know how germs worked for the longest times. You know, in ancient Egypt, cats were seen as divine creatures of health because cats ate mice and mice carry disease. So in a village struck with plague, it's the house that had a cat that would be the house that survived. So people started to associate cats as being these gods of health. And I'm sure they like that very much. So again, filth and disease and these insect-like creatures are evidence of sin, right? It is a moral condemnation by the gods, right? Cleanliness is next to godliness. So filth is sin and demonic. And Herbert West pointed out that there's this odd habit in Miyazaki games to condemn certain parts of the body. So in Bloodborne, the cleric beast has a really massive hulking left arm, and all of the other Yarnamites have these extended, elongated left arms as well. You know, their bodies are very asymmetric like that. In Sekiro, it's like the protagonist is about to be consumed by Shura. He's about to turn into a demon, but then his left arm gets cut off, and suddenly he's saved. Orangutan as well. The sculptor, the orangutan, he is about to be consumed by demons, but then his left arm is removed. You know, when the sculptor turns into a demon, his left arm turns into this giant, fiery, chaotic left arm thing. If we think about Manus, right, the father of the Abyss, he has a giant, hulking left hand arm thing. And why is that? Why is the left arm seen as being sinful or demonic or weird, or what's going on with that? Okay, so in a world before toilet paper, what do? You can't use toilet paper, so I guess you'll have to use something else. So I think even in some Asian cultures today, you shake with the right hand, you eat with the right hand. You never shake or eat with the left hand. The left hand is for other things. So the left hand is the unclean hand, right? So in Bloodborne, where the beasts have these giant left arms, and in Sekiro, where the demon of hatred gets a giant left arm, or Manus, who has a giant left arm, you know, it's all a sign that that's where the uncleanliness is. That is the divine punishment, right? Cleanliness is next to godliness. Uncleanliness is demonic. And so these creatures that have these giant left arms, it's like the filth is sort of building up and amalgamating into their left arms. Or in Bloodborne, where the protagonist actually has one of his legs removed, again, it probably has to do with the unclean dregs all dripping down into one certain part of the body. And then once that body part is removed, now all the uncleanliness and all of the sin dissipates. It's all gone, and the character is now clean now. The character is now like holy and divine and forgiven. And feces is actually a really important symbol in Miyazaki games. It really is. You know, in Sekiro, where you go to a body of water, you know, you descend down to a stagnant body of water, and down there is a giant ape who has a parasite living inside of him, and he throws his feces, right? That's actually kind of an important symbol. It insinuates that he is unclean and sort of living in sin, right? It is a moral condemnation by the gods. Then in Dark Souls 3, there are these giant weird hand creatures known as monstrosities of sin. They live in a toxic swamp, and they always drop dung pies. And take note that the giant hand creatures are kind of like babies. They crawl like babies, they sit like babies, they sleep like babies, they roll like babies. It's a mixture of a hand, feces, and infancy, right? It sort of combines all those things together. So the unclean hand is evidence of sin. But what is that sin, right? Well, these monstrosities of sin are moving around like babies. So I think it is nostalgia. It is the overwhelming desire for childhood or the overwhelming desire for the past that drives people to do things that they probably shouldn't be doing, right? Aldrich eats kids. He probably shouldn't be doing that. That is a divine punishment by the gods, and he's I'm not gonna lie, he's a bit of a turd, right? Again, think about it. When Aldrich eats people, he's able to share in their memories. So when he eats a kid, he's able to have their memories of childhood, and it's like he's able to like re-experience his own childhood, and he's able to satiate his desire or his overwhelming nostalgia that's consuming him, right? And so when people talk about how there is a nostalgia in the darkness, I think that's what can take people over.
There is a darkness within man, and I am afraid you will peer into it. Whether the fear will spark self-reflection or a ruinous nostalgia is up to you entirely.
Right, we see it happen with the Abyss Watchers. We see it happen with Manus. We see it happen with Gale. We see it happen with Artorias, right? The Abyss eventually takes people over. And what is it exactly that takes them over? I think it is that nostalgia. People's desire to go backwards into the past. Right? It's like people want to go back into non-existence. So instead of moving forwards into death, it's almost like they're moving backwards into childhood. And that's why the monstrosities of sin are giant hands, because it represents the unclean hand. They drop these dung pies, right? So again, that is evidence of their sin. And then they move around like babies, because their nostalgia has consumed them, and it has led them to do things that they shouldn't be doing. And so that is their sin. So whenever you find your character descending down, 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 deeper and deeper to a stagnant body of water, that is often an important symbol of all of humanity's sin, all sinking down and accumulating into the deepest part of a stagnant body of water, right? So all of the sin that's happening up here accumulates down here into a giant monster, right? So it isn't even necessarily that the guardian ape is necessarily doing something wrong, but it's that people up here are doing something wrong, and all of their sin is dripping down and accumulating down here, and it all amalgamates together into some kind of monstrosity. In Dark Souls, the protagonist descends into an underground kitchen where people are being chopped up and fed to her. Then the protagonist descends deeper into a complex system of damp, wet, ratty sewers, and at the very bottom is the most epic vagina ever created, the Gaping Dragon. Then the protagonist descends even deeper to a place called Blight Town, where the inhabitants are bloated and they shoot toxic darts, and they have a habit of dropping dung pies all over the place. And at the very bottom is a toxic swamp, as well as another vaginal metaphor named Quelaag. Then the protagonist descends even deeper and discovers this fiery pandemonium, and at the very bottom is the Witch of Izalith, who has a tiny little infantile baby parasite creature living inside of her. So again, it's about descending down, 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 deeper and deeper, and finding the place where all of humanity's sin is accumulating, right? And so the Witch of Izalith, what was she trying to do? She was trying to start a new Age of Fire, or extend the same Age of Fire, by creating a new first flame, a second flame, if you will. And that's a big no-no. You don't do that. That's the big sin of Dark Souls 1. You do not extend the Age of Fire. You take a piece of humanity, shatter it in the bonfire to strengthen the bonfire, and the Firekeeper's heart becomes a nursery for festering parasites that are the embodiment of those smaller pieces of humanity that were fragmented by the fire. The big sin of Dark Souls 1 is Gwyn's bonfire and his stagnant coddling of the first flame, right? Coddling, right? Coddling. You coddle a child, right? That's something that you do with a child.
You must destroy the fading Lord Gwyn, who has coddled fire.
Right, and the original Dark Soul was originally one complete solid entity until the furtive pygmy chopped it up and divided it into smaller pieces of humanity, not to strengthen any bonfire, but to bring about the Age of Men, the Age of Dark. And unlike gods, humans have pieces of the Dark Soul within their bodies and can be hypnotically compelled to seek the abyss. Like the game specifically mentions that Artorias has a tiny bit of darkness within him, so when he enters the abyss, he becomes corrupted by it and the darkness takes over. Humans are prone to seek the darkness again because that's what they are. The abyss and humanity are the same thing. The darkness, the abyss, is the dark soul. That's where humanity originates from. And when all of creation returns to the darkness, the dark soul is made whole again. It's kind of like an interpretation of Brahman in that regard. Again, the ultimate goal in Hinduism is for the individual soul to return to the greater soul known as Brahman. And that takes lifetimes of birth and death and rebirth. And the witch in Dark Souls 3, Carla, specifically says,
There is a darkness within man, and I am afraid you will peer into it. Whether the fear will spark self-reflection or a ruinous nostalgia is up to you entirely.
Right, remember that all-important word, nostalgia? Right, so people look at the darkness with nostalgia because that's sort of like their childhood. That's where they came from. It's like if you have this nostalgia where you just want to go back to your childhood and you just want to go further and further and further back, eventually you're going to hit a point of non-existence. And we should note that the dark abyss is often referred to as like peaceful and quiet, right? It isn't really supposed to be innately bad, it doesn't seem like, but it can be corrupted. Sort of like a stagnant body of water can be corrupted. Deep Protection tells us miracle taught to inaugurated deacons of the Cathedral of the Deep. The deep was originally a peaceful and sacred place, but became the final rest for many abhorrent things. This tale of the deep offers protection for those who worship amidst those horrors. So initially, innately, the deep and the cathedral is supposed to be a place of like peace and meditation and quiet, sort of like the Buddhist nirvana. But then it can be corrupted. And the painter says several times that she wants to paint a picture of a cold, quiet, dark place using the blood of the dark soul. So the dark soul itself is cold and quiet and peaceful. But again, it can be corrupted. So death and darkness and the abyss are not necessarily bad things, not innately. It's actually supposed to be pretty peaceful, like the Buddhist nirvana. So most of us, most of the time, are pretty frightened of death, right? We don't really want to die. But if you've ever studied Buddhism, or like Meta-Buddhist or whatever, it's a pretty incredible way of life.
And he was so sick he could never even get out of the attic room. On a good day, he told me, he could actually just about get out of bed. He'd stagger to the door and realize he hadn't got any energy left and crawl back into bed. And that was for 3 or 4 years he was like that. And every treatment didn't work until one day the head monk went up to this monk's room. He used to be a Rhodes Scholar, a champion wrestler in the United States, very strong, fit guy, and now he was just a shadow of his former self. And the head monk went up to this monk's room, just the head monk and this monk, and said to him, I have come up here on behalf of all the monks in this monastery, all the male, female supporters, and your family as well. I've come up here to give you permission to die. You don't have to get better. You can die if you want. Stop trying to improve. At which point, apparently, this monk just burst out crying, wept and wept and wept, because he was trying so hard to get better. And once he didn't try to get better anymore, that's when he started to improve. That was about 20 years ago. He's alive and well right now. And that was a brilliant piece of emotional intelligence. When someone is really sick, one of the reasons they can't recover is they're trying so hard to get better. So hard that it's making them sick. And that's what's happening with him. As long as he was given permission to die, it doesn't matter, he can die if he wants to, he could relax. And as soon as he relaxed, he started to improve and get better. That's why he's still alive. And I always remember that. That is actually, number one, how to treat people if you're visiting them in hospital. When you're visiting your dear mother in hospital, tell her, Mother, it's okay to die. I'll give you permission to die. And she said, but I'm only in here for a cataract operation. You all should know that the first person to do legally assisted voluntary euthanasia in the world Mr. Dent was a Buddhist from Northern Territory, from Darwin. And I know the reason why he did it. I never met him, but another of my monks did. They saw him in Perth Hospital when he came for treatment. He said he was considering voluntary euthanasia. What was his motivation? Why? And it was, he said, because his wife was giving him 24/7 care and would not take much respite. She thought that was her duty as his wife, and his disease could go on forever. He had no quality of life, and he said, I can endure that as a Buddhist, but I've got compassion for my wife. I want to free her, to give her a life where she doesn't have to always be looking after me. He said, I want to ask for voluntary euthanasia out of compassion for my wife. If you're afraid of death, it makes it happen much quicker. So the best thing, don't be afraid of death. Just enjoy your life. So when death comes, you've had a really, really good time, done all the nice things in life. And you look back, just like on the end of a day, you've had a wonderful day today, come to the Buddhist temple in the evening, gone to school today, had met all your friends, had a wonderful time. What a great day this will be, but it has to come to an end. And when you die, you come to rebirth again, another life, just like you go to sleep tonight, you wake up again tomorrow morning, have another day. That's just like, don't be afraid of death. Death is only the start of another life.
It's about letting go, or it's about being able to let go of the things that are most precious to us. Right? So it's sort of the exact opposite of Gwyn, who cannot let go of the thing that is most precious to him. So in order to reach nirvana, you have to let go of desire. Everything that you desire, even the things that you find most precious, you have to be willing to let go. Right? And that'll end suffering, and that'll help you reach a place of nirvana and enlightenment. And so the dark abyss is, again, it is absence, it is non-existence, it is nothing. In order to exist in a place like that, I think you would have to let go of all desire for anything, right? Most people look at the idea of the dark abyss, and they kind of don't like it. Why would I want to live in a world that is completely pitch black and dark or whatever? But if you're a Buddhist, that is kind of the nirvana. It is nothingness. There is no desire there. There is no suffering. There's nothing there because it is non-existence. So that's kind of the vibe I get from Dark Souls with all of the very incredible vagina creatures, right? So if you think the vagina is where life comes from, right? So if you destroy the vagina, then you have destroyed the thing that creates life. And I think that it might kind of be a part of suicide envy. The idea about, well, that's where I came from, so I need to destroy this thing that I came from, so that way I will never be a thing. Like if you've ever had a moment where it's I wish I had never been born, that's kind of what I'm talking about. The idea that if I destroy this thing that I came out of, then I will have never existed, and I won't have to deal with the problems that I'm having to deal with right now. Destroy the vagina and destroy the woman who made all of life's suffering happen, and by bringing life into fruition. Does that make sense? And it's especially prevalent in Bloodborne, where it's literally one of the bosses is literally a pregnant woman, and she goes bye-bye. And then there's Murgo's wet nurse, where I'm pretty sure that she's pregnant too, probably with the exact same baby, and she goes bye-bye too. And then, there's Rom, who is a much plumper version of this version of Rom, and she's surrounded by these creatures that are known as the Children of Rom. And Rom goes bye-bye too. And then there's, the blood-starved beast, and everyone kind of jokes about being a bit of a vagina monster. And coincidentally, there's a face popping through it, right? And so what do? You stab it! And that metaphor goes bye-bye too. Or even consider the Bed of Chaos. There's a woman who turned into a tree, and then the protagonist dives into her body and finds an infantile little bug creature squirming around and stabs it. There's yet another metaphor that goes bye-bye. It feels like there might be some desire for suicide, but for people who might not necessarily feel like they have the gumption to bring it about, right? Like, I really want life suffering to end, but I don't have the gumption to end my own life. So instead, I'm just going to desire the death of the mother. Like, I remember there was a video by... Angry Video Game Nerd. That's the one. Where he talked about Earthbound. And, like, in Earthbound, the protagonist travels... Is it into the past? I don't know. It was a long time ago. But basically, the protagonist has to kill himself. And himself is described as, like, the root of all evil or something like that. And it's weird because, like, in the way the boss, the way the evil self is depicted, is as being this very obscure baby thing, right? And so, Angry Video Game Nerd's interpretation of it was that, well, it's about overcoming a traumatic childhood, right? Which is a very nice interpretation. I like it. It's very optimistic and very, very American. There's just one very, very tiny little detail that makes you raise an eyebrow. Why is there an umbilical cord attached? You know, it isn't exactly a baby. It's a fetus. It's a baby that hasn't been born yet. And to destroy that thing is to destroy all of the evil in the world. And then, like, all of life's suffering. So again, I think the idea is to say, I wish I had never been born. It is about aborting the self. Destroying the vaginas or destroying these infantile creatures is sort of like suicide envy, saying, life is suffering. I wish I wasn't suffering, but I don't have the gumption to end my own life, to end all the suffering. So instead, I'm just going to fantasize about ending either the mother or the vagina or the child in order to keep all of life's suffering from happening. Does that make sense?
This is where you play as Pooh for the first time. You have to go to the top of a hill known as the Place of Emptiness to meditate. This is another instance where you're supposed to stand still and do nothing. Then a voice calls out and says to stop your meditation immediately. Okay, so I go back to my master and he says to try again. What? So I go back up the hill again. This time I ignore the voice because you can't even trust what the game tells you. Okay. To complete your trial, I am going to break your legs. You will lose the use of them. Do you accept this? Am I supposed to say yes? Ah! This ain't good! I shall then take your arms and feed them to the crows? Oh, sure, why not? I'm almost dead anyway. Ah! Taking my arms, taking my legs, taking my soul, left me with life in hell! Without legs and arms, you can only lie there. Now I'll cut your ears off. Well, my HP is 0, so what could happen? Ah! No legs, no arms, and no sound. Do you care if I take your eyes? Do you want to live in eternal darkness? I shall steal your sight. Do you accept this? Ah! That was weird, man.
And again, it's a very bizarre phenomenon among Miyazaki creations, where it's a bit vaginal in the way it looks. You know, sometimes I like to think that, like, Miyazaki wakes up in the middle of the night and he's just like, there's this peculiarity in Dark Souls 3 where people are turning into plants, they're turning into trees, and then there are other undead creatures who are worshipping those plants and those trees, right? And it's pretty weird, and I don't know if it's ever like outright explained. I don't actually know Dark Souls 3 all that well. But in the Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno, there is a layer of hell where people who commit suicide go, and when they go there, their bodies become entangled in these thorny bushes and stuff, and they start to become trees. So when I saw Dark Souls 3 and I saw this going on, I was immediately just like, oh, so it's about suicide envy, right? It's like you have someone who kills himself, so he becomes a tree. And then you have people worshiping those trees saying, I wish that I could do that. I wish that I could be gone or whatever, right? And again, remember that the Age of Fire is being preserved, right? Gwyn has preserved the Age of Fire. The gods have preserved the Age of Fire. So the dark sign, the darkness, death, is starting to take people over, but then the gods put a ring of fire around it in order to keep that from happening, so people can't die. So Dark Souls 1 is mostly about people trying to preserve the Age of Fire and trying to live immortally. Dark Souls 3, I feel like, is kind of the opposite. It's about people wanting to die. That's kind of the whole point of the trees and of people worshipping the trees. The hollow pilgrims, right? So hollows are people who can't die and eventually they just lose themselves, right? They literally have like trees and roots growing out of their backs, and they use a rock to like smash it down or whatever. And then there's that one pilgrim who says, please undo my shackles, grant me death, right? So it's like the thing that they all want is death, and they're all starting to turn into trees. So there is this association between wanting death, desiring non-existence, and plant life, tree life. And so I think one of the big points of Dark Souls 3 is to say that not desiring life is not the same as desiring death. These are two different things. To not desire life is peaceful and helps people let go and release themselves from their desire and release themselves from their suffering, while to desire death is still wrought with suffering, right? So one of these can help you reach nirvana, one of these cannot. In order to reach nirvana, one must let go of his desire for death as well as his desire for life. There has to be that vacant nothingness. So maybe a part of the corruption of like Aldrich and the Deep and everything like that is that they desire death, they desire the darkness, they desire the dark soul, they desire the darkness within humanity, and that ultimately corrupts them. And again, so it's like the monstrosities of sin turn into these giant filthy baby hand things, right? So it's like they desire nostalgia. And if you keep going further and further and further back with nostalgia in your own life, eventually you will reach a point of non-existent, a point in which you were not born yet. So to desire death is kind of like extraordinary nostalgia, because it's like the person desires to go all the way back to the point in which he did not even exist. And that isn't a good thing in Dark Souls 3. So like Aldrich is kind of the epitome of that, where he desires death. He desires bringing death to people and consuming them, right? He wants to eat death. He wants to consume the darkness within humanity and to indulge in that nostalgia, right? And if we look at Gale, again, he goes corrupted by the blood of the Dark Soul. He is corrupted by the Abyss. He falls into that nostalgia, and his desire for death overwhelms him. His desire for non-existence overwhelms him. And again, Aldrich has a habit of eating kids, right? That's what's commented on the most, is that he likes to eat kids, because that is where the nostalgia is most prevalent. And if we think about Nito in the first game, right before his grave, right before the room where his grave is in, or his tomb is in, or what am I saying? The room before his sarcophagus, you find a bunch of necromancers, the father, the mother, the child, and they're revivifying all of these skeleton baby things, right? And guess what? There's a stagnant body of water down there. So that tells me that, again, children having to do with nostalgia, stagnant water having to do with filth, and death, right? Death, non-existence, They are desiring death. And that is a bad thing in the Dark Souls series. And again, Aldrich and Nito have a lot of visual similarities. And they both like to stab the kids. And again, in order to get to Nito, you have to descend down, 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 deeper and deeper. And at the very bottom is Nito, and right before the very bottom is that stagnant body of water, and a bunch of dead babies who are being revivified. And it's my understanding that you aren't supposed to have an eternal age of fire, nor an eternal age of dark, right? It's supposed to be like waves on a beach, where life comes in, life goes out, life comes in, life goes out, on and on and on. And it isn't supposed to stagnate in either direction. But if it stagnates, if the age of fire goes on for too long, then you have this corruption, the Witch of Izalith. She tries to extend the age of fire, and so these fiery demon parasites arise out of that. Whereas like in Dark Souls 3, it's like the darkness has been stagnating for too long. People are trying to extend the age of dark or whatever. And so these dark insect-like parasite creatures kind of arise out of that. So in either case, it's like you get corruption and you get sin. You aren't supposed to stagnate or desire these things too fervently, otherwise it'll take you over and then hurt the people around you. The Deep Gem says, there is a darkness that lies beyond human kin. And the Great Deep Soul says, Archdeacon MacDonald, a sorcerer himself, delighted in the cathedral's stagnating souls. For him, they represented the glorious bedrock of this world. So the darkness within humanity is one thing, but then there's something even deeper, that is sort of the corrupted form of that darkness, right? So there is the Dark Soul, which is peaceful and kind of innately cold and peaceful is probably how I describe it. And then you have the Deep Soul, right? So within that darkness, there's something that sort of drips down and becomes deeper, and sort of stagnates and corrupts. All right, so that's most everything I think I wanted to talk about. So just to like recap, all of humanity comes from the Dark Soul. The Dark Soul is going to inevitably be made whole again at one point in the future, because the Age of Men will take over. The Age of Men is the Age of Men because men are mortal, unlike the gods. People are not supposed to desire too strongly the Age of Fire, nor are they supposed to desire too strongly the Age of Dark, the Age of Men. In either case, it leads to a corruption. In order to reach a true Age of Dark and to be made whole again, it's like you have to reach this Buddhist nirvana. You have to come to terms with your wholeness in the world, and you have to release yourself from desire. So it's kind of a combination of Buddhism and Hinduism. At least that's my interpretation. I'll end with this, alright? Hopefully I can do this right, because I find it fascinating, but if I do it wrong, it's not going to work. Alright? Let's imagine an individual little ant, right? An individual little ant will sacrifice himself and threaten his own life for the benefit of the colony. Now, if we think of the likelihood of survival of the individual ant, it should decrease if he has that kind of attitude, right? So hypothetically, with just that in mind, and thinking of the one little individual ant, ants should have been extinct a long time ago because they wouldn't have survived, because they would have just thrown themselves on the sword, right? But when we remember that they sacrificed themselves to the benefit of the colony, and we start to consider the colony, the survival of the ants actually makes a lot more sense. When we take it singular to plural, it actually makes a lot more sense, right? Because ants, individual ants, are willing to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of the colonies are more likely to survive. And so ants as a species are more likely to survive. Now, when we think of two colonies that go to war with each other and they actually cannibalize each other, ants should have gone extinct a long time ago, right? Because they will just eat each other. They'll just kill each other into non-existence, won't they? So ants probably should have gone extinct a long time ago. But that isn't really how it works, right? Two colonies go to war with each other, and the bigger, stronger ants eat the weaker, smaller ones. So when the bigger, stronger colony dominates the weaker colony, the weaker ants are suddenly out of the gene pool, and they aren't reproducing anymore. So the ants as a species actually become stronger, because the stronger ants are the ones who are surviving and reproducing. So ants as a species have a higher likelihood of survival if they cannibalize each other and if they go to war with each other and if they dominate each other. So ants as a species are always changing and always mutating a little bit in small dosages in order to increase the likelihood of survival. And so if we think of all the other animals that sort of intrude on this relationship and start eating the ants and everything, it's like life is constantly trying to survive in an ever-changing, chaotic environment, right? Everything is always trying to kill everything. And life, in order to survive, does some very, very bizarre things in order to survive in a very pragmatic world, right? The ants as a species slowly change over time in order to ensure the survival of the species. So as much of a paradox as it sounds, death is necessary to increase the probability of survival, right? Like, the fact that I can grow old and die is important to ensure the survival of the species, right? So in a chaotic, ever-changing environment, I am suited to survive in this environment because I'm doing it right now. But if the environment were to change in 500 years, I wouldn't be suited to that environment and I would probably die, right? So if I have kids and those kids are different from me, that ensures the survival of the species, because it means that the species can actually adapt and change to a chaotic, ever-changing environment, right? So in this long chain of beings, all the way from fish to man and everything in between and everything before and everything afterwards, it is all necessary to increase the probability of survival of life on a chaotic, ever-changing Earth, right? As much of a paradox as it seems, the fact that I will grow old and die is a necessary component for the likelihood of survival of life. And so, if we just for a moment stop thinking about life as being an individual ant or an individual colony or an individual or an individual community of colonies or an individual ecosystem, and we think of life as being this whole complete organism that is just struggling to survive in a very chaotic environment, life starts to make a bit more sense, and maybe we can start to imagine how we fit into this very grand narrative, right? My human conception of who I am is very, very human, right? Again, the ant doesn't really feel anything, doesn't really think all that much, he just sort of exists. He doesn't have my perspective of the world, and I don't have his. So how I perceive myself is very different from how he perceives his self. When we think of life as just this singular concept, right? Life on Earth as a singular organism that is constantly changing and growing and adapting and shrinking and taking on all these different forms in order to survive in this environment, it makes sense how life has been able to survive for millions of years, for a long, 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 long time. And even if there is a nuclear holocaust on Earth, and seemingly all of life is wiped out, I have a feeling life will come about again, and will change and will adapt, and will just treat nuclear radiation as if it's salad. There was a case of an astronaut who sneezed on equipment. The equipment was left in space, like on the moon, for years or whatever. Then it was retrieved and brought back down to Earth, and then the bacteria was found on the device. The bacteria was put on a petri dish and then was revivified, right? It was brought back to life, and the bacteria just went back to doing normal bacteria things as if nothing had changed. Life is incredibly, incredibly stubborn, and it is very, very, very difficult to extinguish. And it's able to do things that should be impossible. So when we reduce our human conceptions of what I am and what my place is, I think life starts to make a lot more sense. And when I look at life, not as a bunch of individual organisms, but as this one organism that is constantly growing and shrinking and changing and adapting to a chaotic environment, its stubborn persistence and refusal to die actually makes a lot more sense. And even things like aging and the death brought about by that aging makes sense for the survival of life as a whole. So in Dark Souls, where life starts off as this singular soul breaks apart and comes back together, it doesn't seem all that unfamiliar to what I look at when I study biology and the natural world, I guess. And maybe that is something like the god of the Dark Soul.